Hello. Fun fact about Trick Room teams in competitive singles, they're not very good. Trick Room was introduced in Generation 4, and ever since then people have constantly tried to make it work because it is a fun strategy, but it's never really been able to live up to other team structures like stall, hyper offense, bulky offense, in terms of just plain viability. And that's kind of a shame. So I wanted to do a very brief summary of Trick Room teams, Generations 4 through 9, specifically in the OU tier, and only in singles, not VGC. Okay, so real quick, Trick Room teams only have 5 turns before they run out of turns, and they also don't have any items or abilities to make it last longer. This means that Trick Room teams are almost always going to be hyper offense oriented, since they need to make do with what they have. Usually you have more than one Pokemon with access to Trick Room, but one main setter, and sometimes, depending on your preference, you also have a fast Pokemon to use when you don't have any Trick Room turns left. Although I won't be covering those since that's not the most teams. So starting out with Gen 4 OU, Trick Room is a very accessible move overall, with 6 Pokemon in the OD tier having it and multiple outside of that tier also possessing it, 43 in total. However, not every candidate is ideal, as you want a Pokemon to be as slow as possible. So for example, Azelf possesses it, and it's not an ideal since he's a very fast Pokemon. So who are our Trick Room setters this gen? Well, Bronzong is, in my opinion, the best Trick Room setter in Gen 4, and will actually continue to be one of the best Trick Room setters for multiple generations. Bronzong is a bulky Pokemon on both the physical and special side with 2 great abilities, helping him negate his biggest weaknesses in Heat Proof and Levitate. On top of that, he can hit very hard as well, and he has access to Gyro Ball, Earthquake, and Explosion, which at this point is easily a base 500 base move because it hasn't been nerfed yet. And if you choose to run a Trick Room Bronzong, you can also choose a Macho Brace, which halves your speed. However, he's already a very slow Pokemon, so you don't really have to use that. Instead of that, you can use a Naka Berry, a Lumberry, or Leftovers. On top of that, because of its great defensive stats, you don't have to worry about him being O-code. He was by far the most common Trick Room lead, but others included Dusknar, an incredibly bulky Ghost-type Pokemon, who mainly was known for being able to cripple physical attackers via Will-O-Wisp, but also he has access to the elemental punches such as Thunder Punch, Ice Punch, and Fire Punch. He's not particularly strong, but he's bulky, similar to Bronzong. Next is Cresselia, another very annoyingly bulky Pokemon who will continue to be a very prominent Trick Room setter for multiple generations to come. She's ranked UU in this gen, but it doesn't mean she's not viable. It's just that she's a fairly passive Pokemon, and it can be hard to fit her on a multitude of team structures, who's slow and very much capable of running Trick Room. She's essentially a Lugia, but an OU legal Lugia. Also, Slowbro. He's not outspeeding anyone, and it's obviously a very bulky Pokemon as proven by his existence on stall teams. He can also hit very hard by accessing Calm Mind. The problem is that taking turns to set up is kind of a waste for a strategy like Trick Room, that a lot of Pokemon that have access to setup moves like Calm Mind or Dragon Dance or Swords Dance will usually not go for it since they rather just try to straight up attack. Unlike Sun and Rain teams, we cannot in any way waste turns. He's not Growth Venusaur. If you get the chance to attack, you really have to take it. So, on that topic, on to sweepers. Snorlax, one of the strongest Pokemon in the game, is now OU by technicality. He's a slow and bulky Pokemon, and very, very strong. Snorlax is not a common Pokemon in Gen 4 OU. The amount of fighting types and overall better physical attackers didn't make for a very welcoming environment for Snorlax, but he can be pretty menacing. You're honestly going to want pretty much to spam return until the milk tanks come home. He can use Curse, but again, turns are very valuable. Besides, those stab, return, and double edges will hurt anyways. On top of that, he has Fire Punch, Ice Punch, Thunder Punch, Superpower, Pursuit, and Earthquake. Snorlax's most common sets include Rest plus Curse, but in this variation, you're probably going to want to just straight up attack like I said. But still, you can try to fit Rest and Curse on there since it can be very powerful. Overall, this is a very nice way to breathe some life into a Pokemon that isn't really used overall because of his very low speed and the fact that he's just being outclassed at this point. Machamp. Machamp, unlike Snorlax, is a very common Pokemon in Gen 4 OU. He's one of the hardest killers in the metagame, with Dynamic Punch and Focus Punch being able to OHKO many Pokemon. However, his low speed obviously is to his detriment, except on Trick Room teams. Both abilities are good on him, and while Machamp normally will use Substitute to save you on turns, you're going to probably want to skip out on that and just use Dynamic Punch, Stone Edge, Payback, and Ice Punch. He's overall a very infuriating Pokemon to deal with because he's not fun to switch into, particularly because Dynamic Punch can confuse Pokemon even if you're resistant to the attack. And now one of his only flaws to be exploited, his speed, is no longer an option. So one of the best Pokemon to have on Trick Room in this generation. Next is Tyranitar. Tyranitar is a Pokemon who is actually very commonly ran Scarf to get rid of his low speed stat. However, in this sort of team, it's obviously going to be to his advantage. Tyranitar is one of the best mixed attackers in the tier, giving Infernape a run for his money. He's a great wall breaker and gives Jirachi a run for his money as well, and with one of the highest usage rates. So it's great to not have to worry about his low speed stat and not have to lock him into a moveset because he is such a great mix attacker. Tyranitar has many movesets, and I'm going to try to do this all in one take, but these are the moves that he usually runs. Earthquake, Pursuit, Crunch, Rock Slide, Superpower, Ice Beam, Aqua Tail, Fire Punch, Ice Punch, Fire Punch, Low Kick, and Payback, among more. So definitely a Pokemon that took advantage of a physical special split. And while he is a bit of an unorthodox typing, his natural bulk makes up for it, as well as immunity to Psychic and a tier filled with Psychic type Pokemon. Next is Hatterene. Hatterene is one of the best Pokemon in Gen 4. Lots of Pokemon who are considered the best in Gen 4 are considerably slow actually. Hatterene has many move pools and usage from Stealth Rock Lead to Eruption. Specifically, Trick Room Hatterene is particularly offensively oriented actually, with a great stat typing and defensive typing. He'll usually run Eruption, Fire Blast, Earth Power, Explosion, the Hidden Powers, Dragon Pulse, Magma Storm. He's an excellent trapper, the best in the tier actually, and will usually run Pasha / Shuka Berry to cover his most prevalent two weaknesses. It beats potential Jirachi, Blissey, and Skarmory. So, you know the most beloved non-mentally draining Pokemon to go up against. Magnezone. Magnezone is one of the best and honestly overlooked typings out there. He has a fairly amazing stat spread, with speed being the only one that's, kind of lackluster. Magnezone was particularly useful because via Magnet Pull, it managed to trap Skarmory and Fortress and kill it commonly by running Thunderbolt or Hidden Powers. On top of that, it also ran Flash Cannon and Explosion. Offensively, that pretty much sums it up because a lot of what it runs is non-damaging moves, but you could run Magnet Rise, Substitute, Protect, Toxic, Thunder Wave. That would obviously be kind of counterintuitive though, since you really want to take advantage of your turns. So a bit less to say, but to be fair, you don't need much. It already has a really good typing, solid move pools. Empoleon. Empoleon is another Pokemon with an amazing typing. Empoleon would typically be used as a potential lead with Stealth Rocks. Probably one of its best traits was his whole array of resistances, especially to Dragon, but offensively, it's very menacing as well. That is if you actually manage to land a goddamn Hydro Pump. Besides that, he has Grass Knot, Knockoff, Ice Beam, Aqua Jet leftovers, and is usually the go-to item for bulky Pokemon like him is Specs. It's the best to maximize his offensive potential alongside a Life Orb, and that's the same for a lot of these Pokemon with Choice Band accordingly. Next is Dragonite. Dragonite was a great choice because although it can be EV'd to be a fast Pokemon, and his extreme speed does give him a priority move, he's not particularly that slow, but he's also not terribly fast. He has a great move pool though, and yeah, it's pretty fantastic. He'll run Superpower, Fire Punch, Ice Punch, Thunder Punch, Outrage, Stone Edge, and Draco Meteor. Even though all of the moves I named were important, Outrage is incredibly powerful on him, and he has the most powerful Outrage in the tier. Actually, it's Okos or 2 KOs, basically everything at sight that isn't a Steel type. Also, he's one of the only Pokemon that can deal with Scizor reliably. Next is Breloom. Breloom is really annoying, and I'm going to keep it short because I don't like him. He's the best Spore user in the tier. Focus Punch and Mach Punch really hurt off of him, and has one of the best abilities ever in Poison Heal. Again, one of the only downsides of him was his speed stat and the amount of weaknesses that he has. That was what made him kind of an easily exploitable Pokemon to deal with. Next, speaking of annoying priority move users, let's talk about Technician Scizor. Scizor has one of the best typings in the whole game, Bug and Steel. Scizor has one of the strongest hitters in Gen 4, and unlike a lot of slow Pokemon with the high attack stat, he's not frail and he can hit very hard because of his priority moves. He was already a common Choice Band user, even outside of Trick Room teams, but Trick Room takes a Pokemon that's already almost perfect and makes it even more annoying to deal with. The last Pokemon I'll talk about for this gen is Metagross. Metagross has a great typing, with it being the best semi-check to Jirachi. He's a very strong Meteor match, and Zen Headbutt, and Explosion, and Thunder Punch, and Ice Punch. He's annoying, and he's kind of the reason that my Flygon hasn't been able to be an effective sweeper in certain games, so we're moving on. That's it for Gen 4. While I talked a good amount about the potential sweepers, it actually wasn't that popular just because Trick Room teams are always going to have a difficult time in every generation, because 5 turns is literally nothing. It was okay though, viability wise, although it's not unviable because there really isn't a lack of strong, slow attackers. But if you go and play Gen 4 OU right now, you'll see that you won't exactly face a lot of Trick Room teams. Eventually you'll have to deal with one, but you'll have to wait for a while. And if I'm gonna be honest, this is kind of something we'll see for every single generation. In my video about Stall and Sun teams, in different generations, Stall was really at different levels of viability. But for Trick Room, it's kind of been at a constant stale point in its career where it's never been super viable, but just relevant enough to have enough to talk about. Anyways, on to Generation 5. Trick Room teams, again, are not very common in Gen 5 because weather teams are really dominant, to put quite simply, but when they did come into play, usually it was these Pokemon. For Trick Room setters, I mentioned the last one that Bronzong was still going to be a good setter, and that's true. He's still very bulky and can set up Stealth Rock, so he's overall really good and has a very powerful Gyro Ball. However, a new Pokemon I would like to talk about is Cofagrigus, who has a very amazing physical defensive stat. He has the 18th highest defense stat of the whole game. Plus, he's now outspeeding anyone, which is pretty good for what we want to do. And he already has a great physical defense stat. So you can invest in a special defense stat. Besides Trick Room, he would usually run Shadow Ball, Hidden Powers, Nasty Plot, Will-O-Wisp, and Knockoff. Breaking through him is very difficult if you're a physical attacker, and if he Will-O-Wisps you, it's pretty much impossible. Porygon-2. Porygon-2 is a Pokemon that I feel like I rarely see, but when I do, he's always really annoying, and he's going to be a very constant Pokemon when we talk about Trick Room. Porygon-2 is one of the best Eviolite users, and is a great Trick Room user. He's also very capable of being a good attacker. He has a good move pool with access to Tri-Attack, Ice Beam, Discharge, and Recover. Overall, definitely better than his evolution. Next is Slowking, who has gained an amazing new ability in Regenerator, one of the best in the game. Although he wasn't used all that much in OU, in Trick Room he was great since keeping your Trick Room setter alive is pivotal, and now it's much easier with that ability. Besides that, he has access to Scald, Fire Blast, Flamethrower, Ice Beam, Grass Knot, Psychic, and Psyshock. Good Pokemon, fantastic buff. Next is Jirachi. I didn't mention her last gen, only because I forgot to, but I'm mentioning her now. She is a fantastic Pokemon, like I said. In Generation 4, she was unanimously the best Pokemon in the tier, and now in Generation 5, she was still pretty great. Not the best Pokemon, but still one of the best Steel types. She could actually be a potential good Trick Room user in both because her 100 base speed stat is again right at the cusp of being too fast. She has way too many good qualities to not attempt using her. She's no longer the #1 Pokemon in the format, but she's still extremely useful. This is a very specific variation of Jirachi that uses Trick Room, will run Healing Wish, U-Turn, and pretty much any filler attack like Iron Head or Psychic. It wasn't the most common variation, but then again, Trick Room wasn't that common in general. But its strong Steel typing makes it a great candidate with all the potential Outragers flying around. Although she did have to watch out because this gen was basically the generation for ground types, with Excadrill, Landorus, and Garchomp running rampant. Next is Reuniclus, a sometimes controversial Pokemon. He's an iconic Pokemon in Generation 5 OU and has access to Trick Room. Reuniclus has among one of the best abilities in the game in Magikarp, unfortunately being outdone by Clefable. But he's much more offensively oriented and has a great move pool. While you probably won't set up via Calm Mind, he has access to Psychic, the Hidden Powers, Thunder, Focus Blast, Signal Beam, and Recover. He's great because he's fantastic against Ferrothorn, the passive damage king, as well as Skarmory, and with these moves, it can target many popular attackers like Tentacruel, Starmie, and Heatran. My only tip is that you should start praying if you really want to hit the Focus Blast. Victini. Victini isn't exactly ranked OU, it's ranked UU, but it has a place in OU since it has really great moves and coverage. It has access to Bolt Strike, V-Create, U-Turn, Zen Headbutt, Thunder Punch, Focus Blast, and best of all, Trick Room. He's a lot like Jirachi because he's also a Psychic type mythical Pokemon with base 100 stats all across the board, and that means that it's just again at the cusps of being too fast for Trick Room, but passable. Overall, Victini has many weaknesses and is outdone by faster Scarfers, but on a Trick Room team, he's very menacing, since put very simply, V-Create has a comically high base power, and off of his attack stat, it can hurt a lot. Also, I would like to add that a lot of the Pokemon that I talked about last gen for sweepers are still valid Pokemon to use right now, but I'm going to talk about some new ones. Crawdon. So Crawdon is a Pokemon that now has adaptability, since hidden abilities were introduced in Generation 5. Crawdon is a Pokemon who's a lot like Quagsire in the sense that he's never ranked super highly, but he can ignore the concept of tiers because of how difficult he is to switch into with his ability. Unfortunately, he has a 55 base speed. Normally he would run Dragon Dance, but for Trick Room, Life Orb or Choice Band would be the best. He would often run Waterfall, Crunch, Superpower, Crab Hammer, and Knockoff. While he doesn't have that many moves, Dark and Water are both great offensive typing, so he doesn't really need much. Next is Machamp, but he started taking SARMs because he finally found out that to enter Mr. Olympia, you can't actually be natty. Conkeldurr, obviously. Also an honorary member of the Annoying Ability Club, with 3 pretty good abilities, but Guts was pretty much the obvious choice. He's very straightforward as well, with a whole bunch of moves like Earthquake, Drain Punch, Ice Punch, Fire Punch, Thunder Punch, Knockoff, and Superpower, as well as Stone Edge. He's a great Pokemon on Trick Room, but he ultimately struggles because of his speed stat, which is why this is great for him. Chandelure is pretty great either way, and to be honest, it doesn't exactly need Trick Room, but it sure doesn't hurt it. Chandelure has a great offensive typing and has a very high special attack stat, and usually it'll run Scarf to make up for that 80 base speed stat. But now it has more freedom to run Specs, Air Balloon, or Life Orb, etc. It'll usually run Fire Blast, Shadow Ball, the Hidden Powers, and Trick. Next is Mamoswine. Mamoswine was a good Pokemon in Gen 4. I could have mentioned in the last gen, but I feel like he was better in Gen 5 because of the sheer amount of ground types dominating the OU tier, like Garchomp and Landorus, who get straight up OHKO'd by his Ice Shard, that along with Stab Earthquakes and good bulk, makes him a very good Pokemon. It's very difficult to stay in on Mamoswine because he has great coverage, since he has Superpower as well, and he's overall a very common choice bander. A very simple choice band is very effective, and it's all you need for him. And last but not least, Ferrothorn. Ferrothorn is mostly a utility mon who is known for spamming Stealth Rock, Spikes, Leech Seed, but another set for Ferrothorn is a Choice Band set. And this is pretty great because it can beat out other Ferrothorn in a Magneton with Gyro Ball, Bulldoze, Power Whip, or Bullet Seed. It's kind of unorthodox, but a Gyro Ball is very powerful coming from his abysmal speed stat. Anyways, that's a very, very small summary of Generation 5. Overall, like I said, Weather was the most common type of teams to run, as well as bulky offense and hyper offense. Trick Room really wasn't that popular. You're gonna have to get used to hearing me say that. So Generation 6. So as far as new Trick Room users, there really aren't that many Trick Room setters. The ones that we used in the past are still the ones being used today, like Bronzong, Cofagrigus, Slowbo, Cresselia, Porygon-Z, or Z, I forgot which one is which. Anyways, those are still going strong, but I wanted to mention Mega Diancie as well. Mega Diancie now has Trick Room with a pretty unorthodox typing and a really cool ability in Magic Bounce. Mega Diancie is a strong lead, not only because she can use Trick Room, but she can also set up with Stealth Rocks. Unfortunately, she's a little too fast, and by a little I mean way too fast. I did want to mention her for the sake of just trying to be thorough, but yeah, that 110 base speed stat is a little bit too high. Anyways, last Trick Room setter I'll mention is Mew, who again, almost too fast but just slow enough. Mew at this point is extremely versatile since his move pool hasn't been nerfed. He can literally run anything and is ultimately at this point one of the best utility mons. So besides Trick Room, he runs Stealth Rocks, Toxic, Will-O-Wisp, Taunt, Defog, Soft Boil, etc., or a variety of offensive sets. I can't cover them all. Mega Gardevoir. Mega Gardevoir also has access to Trick Room. Mega Gardevoir is a very strong wall breaker in Generation 6 and has access to Trick Room. Mega Gardevoir, as well as having a good typing since it's part fairy, is especially fun to run because of her ability Pixelate. That makes her really stand out offensively. She'll run Hyper Voice, Future Sight, Focus Blast to Hidden Powers, and Psyshock, which can help her beat Blissey. Anyways, not only that, but Gardevoir has an amazing special defense stat, so it's bulky and strong enough, pretty good and good enough to be a Trick Room setter. Next is Mega Bayonet. Mega Bayonet isn't a super reliable Trick Room setter, but he's slow and strong. Unfortunately, he's not bulky. Besides that, he also has Prankster, and unlike other Prankster users, he can actually hit strong. So Prankster plus Taunt, Will-O-Wisp, and his 165 attack stat makes for a fun Pokemon again. Not a bulky Pokemon, but hopefully he's not your main Trick Room setter, and he's good as a backup. So as a full-on offensive Pokemon, he's far more useful. Next is Azumarill. Azumarill also has a really cool offensive and defensive type, and is one of the best abilities in the game and huge power. This means that it mainly has 2 sets, both offensively oriented. It has one Belly Drum set and a Choice Band set. On the Belly Drum set, it'll often run Waterfall, Superpower, and Play Rough, and honestly, same thing on the Choice Band set. But since it's Trick Room, there's a chance that you won't to use Choice Band. Besides that, you can also run Aqua Jet, which has priority to help out when Trick Room runs out, because it will probably run out, let's be real. Anyways, Bisharp. Bisharp was UU in the last generation, and is now ranked OU in Gen 6. One of the reasons it's now a Steel type is because it has a better offensive typing now since Fairy was introduced, and Steel no longer resists Dark. Essentially, he now has a pretty S-tier stab typing with 9 resistances and 2 immunities. He has an amazing move pool with Knockoff and a very strong Pursuit. He's great against the Latios twins, Altaria, and Gengar. He has access to Swords Dance, Iron Head, Knockoff, and Sucker Punch. Overall, he's one of the best legging sweepers in the tier, Big glow up from Generation 5. Anyways, now time for one of my favorite bug types ever, Heracross. Mega Heracross to be specific, and now he has the second highest attack stat in the whole game, right after Mega Mewtwo. So, in my opinion, he's the best wall breaker in the tier. Now he not only got that huge attack buff, but he also has a defensive buff. And while he got a decrease in his speed stat, it wasn't really outspeeding anyone anyways, let's be honest. And besides, that decrease in his speed stat is fine because again, we got more bulk to compensate with. And that doesn't matter if you're running him on a Trick Room team, the slower the better. He has a great coverage in Rock Blast, Pin Missile, Bullet Seed, Close Combat. Not only that, but he has Skill Link, which is essentially a built-in loaded dice. It's kind of funny, but Mega Heracross is literally your average hyper offense user's wet dream. He's like a bug version of Mega Mawile. Mega Scizor, particularly a great Pokemon because if you run out of Trick Room, he's still fully capable of working by himself since he also has priority moves like Bullet Punch. He's not really going to get OHKO'd anyways, so he's really reliable. Besides that, Pokemon that I talked about last gen are still relevant, like I said, like Tyranitar, Conkeldurr, Breloom, Magnezone, Crawdon, Jirachi, and Reuniclus. Overall, we had some amazing slow mons. The same problems from Generation 4 and 5 are still problems here. At least we did have a new Pokemon like Mega Heracross though. Next was Generation 7 Trick Room teams. As for setters, Bronzong, Cresselia, and Porygon-Z are still pretty much the go-tos. But as for a more unconventional setter, guess who has access to Trick Room? Mimikyu. Mimikyu is one of the best abilities in the whole game in disguise. That makes her a great candidate for Trick Room. Unfortunately, it's better on paper than it is in practice because she doesn't have the best bulk. Otherwise, it has a really cool stab typing with Play Rough, Shadow Claw, Shadow Sneak, and Leech Life, as well as Storage Dance if you want the setup. It's a cool Pokemon, but it never really lived up to the hype onto an actual busted fairy type, Mega Mawile. I talked about Mega Heracross and how he was just kind of on another level. Mega Mawile is just Mega Heracross on SARMs, plus a better typing. She has the second best typing in the game and an ability that absolutely elevates it. It is the best wall breaker in the game. It straight up has you wondering, how do I even cover that, because she has great coverage in Play Rough, Iron Head, Thunder Punch, Ice Punch, Fire Fang, Knockoff, Sucker Punch. So with Trick Room, there's really no stopping it, since even the best physical wall Skarmory takes too much damage from a Thunder Punch. Even its ability Intimidate before Mega Evolve only adds to how good it is. It's honestly kind of busted, that's why it was banned in the previous gen. One of the only Pokemon that can actually wall it is Toxapex, and even Mozart had his flaws, I guess. Anyways, another Pokemon with the Fairy Steel typing, Magnera. It's one of the most versatile special attackers with an amazing move pool. One of the best move pools I've ever seen, and it will go on to get banned actually in future generations. It overall checks all the boxes for a good Trick Room setter. It has a good typing, one of the best typings, like I said. One of the best Pokemon for Trick Room teams has been introduced in Hoopa Unbound. It's not only one of the best wall breakers, but it's one of the best stall breakers as well, as it's one of the few Pokemon that stall really can't deal with. She's an amazing mixed attacker and has 160 and 130 based attack and special attack. She also has a great signature move in Hyperspace Fury, and she has a great coverage in Gunk Shot, Drain Punch, Fire Punch, Psychic, Dark Pulse, Psyshock, and Focus Blast. It can honestly threaten anyone, but because of its abysmal speed stat and quadruple weakness to U-turn, it was stuck at UBL, but it's pretty perfect for Trick Room. There is a reason why it was ranked Uber previously. Alolan Marowak. Alolan Marowak is ranked RU, but it's still potentially a candidate for Gen 7 Trick Room teams, or any Trick Room teams further on. With Thick Club, it hits its 110 attack stat goes up to 210. It usually will run Flare Blitz, Shadow Bone, Earthquake, Boomerang, and Low Kick. However, Trick Room teams is potentially the only place you'll see it, because even though its bulk isn't bad or anything, it's very much vulnerable to Stealth Rock damage, and with a speed stat like that, it's not worth trying out unless you're on a Trick Room team. Honestly, I'm going to be so real, Generation 7 Trick Room teams weren't it. Like, it really hasn't been it for any generation so far, but they really weren't it for Generation 7. One of the reasons was that after certain stall mons got banned in Generation 7, it was a pretty offensively oriented generation, so you wouldn't think that it would necessarily be a bad thing, but there were too many Pokemon that were hitting too hard to justify a playstyle like Trick Room. When it comes to Gen 7 Trick Room sweepers, most of the mons I talked about last gens are still valid options, but there really weren't a whole lot of new ones to talk about. Overall, a sad generation for Trick Room. We're going to move on to Generation 8, because I don't want to milk this generation if it's not worth it. Generation 8. So a new Trick Room user has been introduced, and her name is Hatterene, who's pretty much the go-to Trick Room setter now, and for Generation 9. Hatterene has a good defensive stat typing and an amazing ability that makes her a good lead for Trick Room, or not with Magic Bounce. With Magic Bounce, it allows her to be your team's hazard control, and it'll usually act as a utility mon with Thunder Wave, Aromatherapy, Nuzzle, and Healing Wish. But for Trick Room sets, you can also run Healing Wish, and then usually 2 offensive moves like Mystical Fire, Scythe Shot, or again Healing Wish like I said. Even though it's not particularly offensively menacing, her bulk, if invested in correctly, makes her really difficult to get off the field, and if you're running Trick Room team, she's the go-to choice. Next is Melmetal. Melmetal is the greatest thing to happen to Trick Room teams since Mega Mawile. Melmetal is perfectly capable of OHKOing a good amount of Pokemon in this tier with the Stab Double Iron Brash. Even Toxapex with defensive investment has to watch out for it. It really has only Ferrothorn that can stop its Double Iron Brash, and for Ferrothorn it has Fire Punch, and it even has a higher defensive stat than Skarmory and the best mono defensive typing in the game. Besides Double Iron Brash, it'll run Thunder Punch, Earthquake, Superpower, Ice Punch, and on Trick Room teams, he can seem pretty much invincible. The only thing that particularly hinders him is his pretty terrible special defense stat, so Assault Vest is a pretty common move to run alongside Leftovers. It can handle the Tapu's Ferrothorn and with Superpower Weavile as well. Anyways, I'm going to talk about Stakataka. I could have talked about him for the last gen, but given that he's a rather niche Pokemon for Trick Room options, I'm going to talk about him in this one. There's really not much to say about Stakataka. It's usually going to be chosen for one reason, and that is that, no exaggeration, he has one of the lowest speed stat in the entire game. I'm pretty sure he's second to Shuckle, and that translates to a very strong Gyro Ball. It has an even stronger Gyro Ball than Ferrothorn, and I'm going to be honest with you, because of his bad typing, that's all I can really say of Rock and Steel, that's kind of the most he can offer your team. Besides that, he runs Body Press, Earthquake, and Superpower. He does have access to Trick Room as well, although obviously he should not be your main setter under any circumstances. Next is Drexels. It's usually given the ability Sand Rush, but in this scenario, Hustle is going to be what you want to choose. He has access to signature move Bolt Break, Fire Fang, Dragon Claw, Earthquake, and although Hustle allows him to hit very hard, you'll have to watch out for physically defensive ground types like Hippowdon, priority move users like Weavile particularly. He also has especially offense variants, but we don't care about that because Hustle only works for your physical moves. At this point, I'm going to deal into some lower tier Pokemon that were often used on Trick Room teams because I'm at the point where I've kind of sort of maybe possibly ran out of OU sweepers to talk about. Crawdon, Conkeldurr, and Reuniclus are still possible sweepers, but again, you really only see them in the context of Trick Room teams. Unlike bulky offense or balance or even stall, Trick Room is really redundant and hasn't really gotten that much better with time. Structure-wise, a lot of the Pokemon from the past ones are still staples in this one. And besides the flaws of Trick Room that I talked about previously, this is another flaw. Since there's not a lot of variety in Trick Room teams, and they've been the same for various generations, it's getting more and more easy to counter. I hate that I have to do this 2 times in a row, but I don't want to recycle the same Pokemon I talked about previous gens, so I'm just going to have to move on to the next generation, which is our current one, and it's a little bit more interesting. Generation 9 was the first time that Trick Room was low-key, high-key, kind of viable, all because of one Pokemon, Ursaluna. I talked about Melmetal, Mega Mawile, and Mega Heracross being very powerful and good for Trick Room, but more powerful than all of them is Ursaluna. Ursaluna single-handedly made Trick Room viable. While Pokemon may be a very complex game of status conditions, predictions, and switching out, at the end of the day, when you really boiled all of it down to the bare minimum, all it really takes to OHKO a Pokemon, and all Pokemon really is a Pokemon hitting another Pokemon hard enough that it dies. The high attack stat is really all that you need, and that's what Ursaluna can offer. See, Ursaluna hits really hard, and it's not just that it has a 140 attack stat, but it also has Guts plus Flame War plus Terra Normal. All of this was just a perfect storm. Even the Pokemon that resisted it, like Great Tusk, with its high defenses and resistance to its facade, still died to a Terra Normal facade. To make Trick Room viable, what you ideally needed was a Pokemon who could OHKO anyone who comes into the field, and that's kind of what Ursaluna finally was. Even Pokemon that are staples of stall like Dondozo and Corviknight can't take on a Terra Normal facade. Besides that, it has access to Headlong Rush, which kind of ruined Pokemon immune to facade, which could have ideally deal with it like Skeletridge. It also runs Swords Dance and Fire Punch. Besides that, King Gambit is a pretty solid choice on not just Trick Room, for literally any team, obviously, given how high its usage rate is. Kingambit has been one of the many sources of many controversies in Generation 9, given just how high its usage rate is, but it's basically the best late game sweeper of all time. Kingambit is basically a Pokemon you have to out-predict if you want to beat. He'll usually run Iron Head, his signature move, which I don't know how to pronounce, Low Kick, Iron Head, Storage Dance, and Storage Dance. Like Ursaluna, Terra is something that turned this Pokemon from amazing to just straight up spectacular, because guessing your opponent's going to Terra his Kingambit too, like Terra Flying, Terra Fairy, or Terra Ghost, is something that can cost you the entire game. It has a great bulk. Next is Garganacl. Garganacl was also a source of controversy at the start. Once upon a time, people wanted to ban it, if you guys remember. So here's the thing, especially for more defensive teams, Garganacl was a problem. Especially if you don't kill it quickly, it can snowball into a very big threat, and defensive teams can't easily kill it quickly because of its stats, which pretty much are tailor-made for competitive play. And its ability, which again is perfect for competitive play, really made it hard to deal with. The only way to really deal with it was to kill it, like with literal damage, and I know that doesn't seem that bad, but once you throw Terra into the mix, its easily exploitable mono rock typing is no longer there, and you have to again guess what Terra type it's going to be. It'll usually run Salt Cure, Body Press, Protect, and Bulk Up. It's a Pokemon that, because of Salt Cure, you'll have to switch around to get rid of, and that just benefits you, the Trick Room user. Garganacl is pretty great. Next is Galarian Slowking. Galarian Slowking has an honest, good amount of offensive use. He's terribly difficult to OHKO and has pretty good coverage in Future Sight, Flamethrower, Sludge Bomb, Psyshock, Surf, Trick Room, Focus Blast, and Chilly Reception. Galarian Slowking is one of the best pivots introduced in competitive singles. Period. With Regenerator, it's a lot easier and safer to set up Trick Room as well, although he shouldn't be your main Trick Room setter, since Hatterene should still take that place. Its typing and move pool allows it to do good damage to Pokemon like Toxapex, Dondozo, and Iron Valiant. You have to face off against it anyways, since it's pretty much on every team structure, from bulky offense to stall, so you might as well just have one on your team. Glastrier. Glastrier is a pretty terrible Pokemon as he's ranked in ZU, but you might see him on Trick Room teams where he can hit first with his 145 base attack stat. He has access to Icicle Crash, Close Combat, High Horsepower, Stomping Tantrum, Instant Headbutt. Along with Chilling Eye, he can really be a great sweeper, and he can be very menacing. I just wouldn't call him reliable. Anyways, onto more normal Pokemon, Iron Hands. Iron Hands has a really cool offensive typing and a great move pool to back it up, with Thunder Punch, Heavy Slam, Drain Punch, Earthquake, and Volt Switch as well. While Iron Hands has fallen off in viability and is now ranked UUBL, it's pretty fantastic on Trick Room. It's pretty annoying to get off the field, not just because it has a huge bulk, but also because of Drain Punch. Plus, although it isn't the best defensively, it only does have 3 weaknesses which can be covered by its teammates. I also wanted to mention Torkoal. I didn't know exactly when to mention him, but now is as good a time as ever as well. Torkoal is mostly known for being a staple on Sun teams, but he can also be ran on Trick Room. Well, he will usually run Specs, Eruption, Overheat, Solar Beam, and Earth Power. Very rarely seen this variation of Torkoal, but it exists. Next is another fire type, Skeledridge. Skeledridge is usually seen on stall teams, but he is fully capable of sweeping, thanks to Torch Song, which raises the special attack and bypasses Substitute. Skeledridge has a really great offensive typing and has a good move pool. Besides Torch Song, it has Hex, Will-O-Wisp, Slack Off, Earth Power, Alluring Voice, and Scorching Sands, with its popular Terra typings including Water and Fairy. I really like this variant of Skeledridge because it's usually chosen as an unaware wall, where you will mostly see it on Ubers more than anything. Take on threats like Dragonite, Zamazenta, and even without Trick Room can still be very effective. I'm going to be very honest with you. Trick Room, while it was at its most viable in this generation, I still wouldn't say is really up there. Like I mentioned Ursaluna, and everyone was really hyping her up, but eventually even her and Garganacl fell to UU and UUBL, so Trick Room still isn't really up there. It's not a really go-to playstyle in Generation 9. Trick Room isn't as common as I made it out to be, and that's partly because bulky offense and Sun teams are so much more common. This might have been kind of a letdown and a sad note to leave this video on, but overall, Trick Room has not been very good and still hasn't been very good even at this gen when it's at its best.